Greetings and thank you for joining me today. We are looking at definitions of spirituality, comparing them to definitions of religiosity, and trying to work out how much difference there is between the two ideas, spirituality and religiosity, and if there are any commonalities and what differences there might be. In addition to looking at definitions of spirituality and definitions of religiosity, I will also be looking into what spirit and spirituality mean, and in particular at their etymology. On reachout.com, which is an Australian website devoted to mental health care, there are some terrific ideas and thoughts there about spirituality. Their definition of spirituality is as follows. Spirituality is defined as individual practice and has to do with personal purpose and peace. It also relates to the process of developing beliefs around the meaning of life and connections with others. Their definition of religion, on the other hand, is presented as an organised set of beliefs and practices, usually shared by a community or a group, and is often perceived as denoting the more formal aspects of worship. I believe that reachout.com has since updated its website a little bit, and I'm not sure if these definitions or these divisions of spirituality are still there. But historically on their website they did divide spirituality into the following forms. One was mystical spirituality, which essentially refers to moving beyond the material world. Authoritarian spirituality, where there is a need for rules and regulations. Intellectual spirituality, which can be achieved by analysing theories. Service spirituality, where people focus on service to others, and social spirituality, where people feel uplifted around other people. So we can see already quite quickly, even just on the basis of looking at one website alone, that spirituality has many angles and aspects to it, doesn't it? Here's an interesting quote from the field of health. Dawson in 1997, who was the researcher, he comments that in spite of being an atheist, he cannot dispel the idea that spirituality has some deep and unrecognised evolutionary benefit. A growing body of evidence has found that spirituality enhances mental and physical well-being. However, it is generally agreed that spirituality is a highly subjective, personal and individualistic concept which defies development of a standard definition. And we do come across this in academia quite a lot. There is not one standard definition of spirituality. In an article entitled Spirituality in Thought, Music and Meditation, Ed Dale, an academic researcher, said that spirituality is as much a part of everyday experiences expressed in music, art or sport as it is a part of meditative and other mystical states of consciousness. So basically Mr. Dale is arguing that spirituality seeps into all spheres of life, which is a very interesting thought. In Reflections on the Spirituality of the Kainai Blood Tribe, the author Genevieve A. Fox, who is a descendant and member of the Kainai Blood Tribe, which is a First Nations band government in southern Atlanta, Canada, with a membership of over 13,000, with Kainai meaning many chief people, says the following. The spirituality of the Kainai people, members of the Siksikaitsi Tapi, the Blackfoot Confederacy, can be defined as a way of being, speaking, living, or in our words, ki pai tapi wa sinuni. The spirituality of the Kainai nation is embodied within the individual. So it's a communal thing or communal spirit that lives within the individual. Spirituality becomes a part of one's being. One's life world is intertwined in everything one does, thinks, speaks, helping one to achieve Matsi Pai Pititini. This is a state of being, of harmony, of spiritual enlightenment, of having Kima Pia Pitsini. Kima Pia Pitsini is a state of being where one has empathy, respect, honours the individual, is compassionate for others. It is the highest level of being one can hope to achieve. Nitsipoisin is a sacred language. The words come from within our bodies as we use our whole body to form the words before they are released with our breath. The same breath that came from our ancestors. It is as if they were the ones speaking. I don't know about you, but I love that definition. It's beautiful. It's very holistic. I thought it was important to just include a little bit of information. This is very, very simplified information on the etymology of the word spirit. Because sometimes, even though we might use the word spirituality, we're not really connecting into the history of the word. And etymology.com is a great website to go and check up the history of the words that we use every day. So generally speaking, if you look at the website etymology.com, the term spirit originally referred to the animating or vital principle in man and animals. So it's our life force. Esprit was another term, usually that was sort of French or Latin. Spirit or soul, something very deep or something very quintessential to who we are. Latin spiritus often referred to breathing, breath, or the breath of a god. And we saw in the previous slide that breathing and language and using inhalation and exhalation was very important to many First Nations tribes. Indigenous peoples are very, very well aware of the connection between breath, life force, appreciation, gratitude, connecting into nature and all those things. So spirare and yuma were also other terms that have historically been used in conjunction with the term spirit, which is very deeply connected to the term spirituality. So within the term spirituality, we also have all these senses embedded, which is wonderful. It is important to note that there is a type of spirituality referred to as negative or dark spirituality. Spirituality is not just fluffy clouds all the time and sunshine and rainbows, but spirituality can be used in dark ways too. So here's a definition of negative or dark spirituality. At psychiatryadvisor.com we are told that negative or dark spirituality is a form of spirituality that manifests itself as a deficit in character, a type of nothingness, one that is often masked by words and actions that do not properly represent the true spiritual state of the individual, group or organisation, and this can cause stress to some people. Negative spirituality can be a sense of feeling abandoned or punished by a higher power. So let us summarise what we have covered so far. Spirituality may encompass but not necessarily be restricted or limited to the following ideas. 1. Our actions in relation to our internal selves. Number 2, it encompasses transcendence and mystical life. Number 3, it can encompass qualities such as forgiveness and compassion. Number 4, it can relate to ancestry, nature and culture. And number 5, spirituality does not necessarily have to relate to a higher power, although it often does for many people. So again, we see there are many, many facets, rich facets, to the field of spirituality. So now we're moving on to definitions of religiosity. So were one asked to characterise the life of religion in the broadest and most general terms possible, one might say that it consists of the belief that there is an unseen order and our supreme good lies in harmoniously adjusting ourselves thereto. Not too far from some ideas about spirituality. Dictionary.com defines religiosity as the quality of being religious, piety, devoutness, affected or excessive devotion to religion. I've known people that were religious, but I wouldn't have said they were excessive. That seems to be a fairly strong word there. Glock and Stark in 1970 defines 5 different dimensions of religiosity. 1, it is experiential, which has to do with personal faith and transcendence. So, in a sense, similar to spirituality, which can be about personal questing. Number 2, it's got ritualistic elements that have to do with worship activities that are reserved for community participation. Number 3, it has ideological aspects to it that have to do with the idea that the church will adhere to certain beliefs. Number 4, intellectual aspects to it, which have to do with how one processes one's ideologies and the church ideologies. Number 5, it's consequential. So these are slightly different aspects between religiosity and spirituality. Spirituality doesn't seem to be as consequential unless you go to the tribal indigenous views, where everything that you do is meant to be imbued with a sense of the sacred and the sense of the spiritual life. So religion tends to have a little bit more to do with ritualistic elements, but that doesn't mean in one spiritual practice one cannot have ritualistic elements too. Here are some further definitions of religiosity. Fukuyama in 1961 identified 4 dimensions to religiosity. 1, it has a cognitive aspect to it, which has to do with an individual's knowledge, that is religious knowledge. Number 2, it has a cultic element to it, which has to do with an individual's religious practice. Number 3, it has a creedal aspect to it, which is concerned with personal religious belief. Number 4, it has a devotional aspect to it, which is concerned with religious feeling and religious experiences. Number 4, I could see as having some similarities to spiritual life. Allport and Ross in 1967 saw religiosity in 2 dimensions, extrinsic and intrinsic. And under extrinsic, they thought that it was more self-serving and utilitarian, and that religion provides the believer with comfort in salvation. Number 2, religion could be intrinsic, and a person that's intrinsically religious might be a person who moves beyond mere church attendance and lives their religion outwardly, demonstrates their religion. In a sense, that is similar to spiritual life. It can be clear that just as there are numerous ways of conceiving of spirituality, there are also numerous ways of conceiving of religiosity. And now to an educational context. The Victorian Early Years Learning and Development Framework, which is an Australian curriculum document, defines spirit as human exploration of being and knowing, a sense of awe and wonder, a search for purpose and meaning within a range of human experiences. The term spirit itself occurs only twice in the document, and the term is situated in the context of describing a child's identity, culture, and spirit. Spirituality is defined in a very similar way to spirit. It is referred to as a range of human experiences, including a sense of awe and wonder, a search for purpose and meaning, and the exploration of being and knowing. Spirituality is used 3 times in the document as a part of the phrase physical, emotional, social, and spiritual well-being, although it is not defined much past this point. Mr. Carl Jung, the noted Swiss psychiatrist, had a lot to say on the spiritual quality of both the individual and collective psyche. Let us read through this quote. He says, in Memories, Dreams and Reflections, "I have frequently seen people become neurotic when they content themselves with inadequate or wrong answers to the questions of life. They seek position, marriage, reputation, outward success or money, and remain unhappy and neurotic even when they have attained what they were seeking. Such people are usually confined within too narrow a spiritual horizon. Their life has not sufficient content, sufficient meaning. If they are enabled to develop into more spacious personalities, the neurosis generally disappears. For that reason, the idea of development was always of the highest importance to me." So spiritual expansion, spiritual literacy, spiritual education, spiritual development, I guess these are important for developing who we are as people, as human beings. I have pulled this quote out of Mr. Jung's writings to illustrate a particular point, which is the link between spiritual problems or spiritual crises and ancestry. See what you make of this quote here. Mr. Jung quotes on a client that he had been seeing, and he says the girl had been suffering for years from a severe anxiety neurosis, which this experience, a previous doctor feeling attracted to her, naturally worsened. I began with an anamnesis, which is a medical history, but could discover nothing special. She was a well-adapted, westernized Jewess, enlightened down to her bones. At first I could not understand what her trouble was. Since, however, I could detect not a trace of a father complex in her, I asked her, as I am in the habit of doing in such cases, about her grandfather. For a brief moment she closed her eyes, and I realized at once that here lay the heart of the problem. I therefore asked her to tell me about this grandfather, and learned that he had been a rabbi and had belonged to a Jewish sect. Do you mean the Hasidim? I asked. She said yes. I pursued my questioning. If he was a rabbi, was he by any chance a tzaddik? She said yes. It is said that he was a kind of saint and also possessed second sight, but that is all nonsense. There is no such thing. With that, I had concluded the anamnesis and understood the history of her neurosis. I explained to her, now I'm going to tell you something that you may not be able to accept. Your grandfather was a tzaddik. Your father became an apostate to the Jewish faith. He betrayed the secret and turned his back on God. And you have your neurosis because the fear of God has got into you. That struck her like a bolt of lightning. Very interesting story with very interesting potentialities in that. No one has any obligations to a concept. And this is another quote by Jung. No one has any obligations to a concept. That is what is so agreeable about conceptuality. It promises protection from experience. The spirit does not dwell in concepts, but in deeds and in facts. Now that's a very interesting statement too, because it's suggesting that there needs to be something action-oriented or action-based about spiritual life. It doesn't and perhaps shouldn't just live in the intellect or inside of us somewhere, never being acted upon. The risk of inner experience, the adventure of the spirit, is in any case alien to most human beings. Well, that's a bit of a bleak statement, but obviously based on Mr. Jung's own personal experiences. What do you think about that page? Here's a very ancient quote from the Bible, Deuteronomy 11 verse 19. I've pulled this up because it demonstrates the important role of parents in the spiritual education of their children, which is not something we're giving a lot of thought or weight to these days. And I just kept it simple. You can go and find this scripture online at BibleGateway.com and read it in its context if you wish to. And here it is. It says, you shall teach them, God's laws, to your children, talking of them when you are sitting in your house, and when you are walking by the way, and when you lie down, and when you rise. It's food for thought. I wanted to share this statement with you because by profession I'm a music teacher and arts educator, and I see many aspects to arts education that can, in our particularly secular day and age, that can draw up a child's sense of spirit and work on their spiritual life. So I included this comment or this quote in this PowerPoint presentation because it is talking about the holy, the sacred, the spiritual, the religious, and I wanted to share it with you. So Westerhoff wrote, he was a reverend, Mr. Westerhoff was a reverend, and he wrote in, I think was it Edward Robinson's book, The Original Vision, which was a book about childhood mystical experiences. Very good book, by the way. He wrote in the introductory passages of the book that the arts incarnate our experience of mystery, wonder and awe. They thereby aid us to encounter the holy or sacred. Our knowledge of God is prior to our conceptualization of God. Religious thought is grounded in religious experiences. Our personal encounter with that ultimate mystery, which is God, is nurtured, expressed, and communicated through dance, music, drama, poetry, painting, sculpture, and film, through the stimulation of the imagination and our visual, oral, and kinetic senses. Religious experience and the arts are related. So are religious experience and liturgy. Through ritual, repetitive, symbolic, aesthetic actions, expressive of the community's story, which is memory and vision, and liturgy's contact with our subjective, experiential, intuitive modes of consciousness, modes which are natural to childhood, the religious imagination and the religious affections are enhanced and enlivened. The distance we have put between ourselves, especially children, ourselves and children, the arts and liturgy have impoverished our religious experience and diminished the effectiveness of educational ministry. Now, this was written back in 1970. Interesting statement. I like that quote there. Our knowledge of God is prior to our conceptualization of God. Religious thought is grounded in religious experiences. The same can be said of the term spirituality. Spiritual thought is grounded in spiritual experiences, however we may come to define them. I've put together this page because I read a lot of articles about spiritual topics, spiritual matters, theologies, all sorts of things. And I've realised in a lot of my readings that at times academia seems to avoid a few aspects of spiritual life, spiritual thinking, religiosity. I think by and large because academics tend to view it as fairly nebulous. But I don't think that's a good enough reason to shy away from them. And so I've noted a few limitations of academic discussions around spirituality for us today, and you are free to agree or disagree with them, that's fine. Words can be used beautifully but cannot always explain or weigh everything to do with a spiritual experience a person may have. Here, a spiritual experience may include a mystical experience, an expanded sense of self, oceanic boundlessness, or some other type of transcendent experience. Academic articles on spirituality tend to medicalise, clinicize, and reduce the spiritual understanding instead of broadening it. There is frequently a very clinical approach to the understanding of spiritual life or spiritual experience. Ideas about soul, the spirit realm, visions, auditory experiences, and what happens spiritually to a person on account of, say for example, something like trauma, they're often avoided by academia, deemed perhaps too nebulous. Direct spiritual experience is not the same as intellectual spiritual commentary, and I don't think that some academics really grasp that. If they're just writing on a topic because they have an interest in it from the point of view that they're into sociology or anthropology, and yet they don't develop their own spiritual life, there is quite a division between the two states of being, the two states of mind. That is direct spiritual experience and an intellectual approach to a spiritual experience. Academia does not always reflect or translate well to the lay perspective on spirituality. In other words, academia can be quite challenging to get through. There's a lot of technical terminology, lots of quotes. The script is often broken up with lots of quotes in parentheses, and that is just how academia has to work. They have to situate their ideas in philosophical certain perspectives, and that's how it's done. And so sometimes it can be quite challenging to read through some types of articles. We do need to make sure, I feel, that when we do academic research, that it has relevance for the average person, and that the average person can read and understand what the academics have been researching. So these are just a few little thoughts I've had about limitations of academic discussions around spirituality, and limitations that I've discovered in my own research on these topics and many others like it. And I'll leave that with you to ponder. You can, as I said, you can agree or disagree. It's up to you. Because I've been studying spiritual life and definitions of spirituality for a long time, I've decided to play around with my own definition of spirituality. And it's quite a long one, and for better or for worse, I don't know. But I thought I'd put this down here to prompt a little bit of thinking. Again, you are always free to agree or disagree. But my thinking in this definition here is to incorporate an aspect that academia frequently overlooks. When academic articles discuss spirituality, they often fail to understand that their subjects that they study believe in spirits like demons or angels, and that's a very big part of spiritual life, but it is frequently not addressed. Instead, very technical, clinical data is sought out, and that is one point that seems to be missed, but I think it's a point that needs to be included in our understanding of spiritual life. Because if you go back to the etymology of spirituality, it's spirit, which has to do with some type of essence which is animated, which may or may not work independently to us. And that's what I try to explain in this definition. It's lengthy, so maybe just close your eyes and have a little bit of a think about what I'm saying here. So here it goes. Spirituality is the exploration of the human psyche and of all of its components, both discoverable and undiscoverable. It is the revealing of latent but valuable impetuses therein, which can be drawn up to consciousness and explicitly shaped, thereby establishing a respectful relationship between our conscious and unconscious selves, or the yin and yang of living. Spirituality is about acknowledging our energetic components and the ramifications of such, just as an inventor relies on his imagination to bring a product into a material state, so our imagination is completely relevant to the development of our internal and external lives. Immateriality becomes the source of materiality, and development may be also a form of questing. And hence, those manifestations we deem immaterial, such as angels, demons, spirits, devas, they rightfully belong to our explorations just as much as intellectual and concrete modes of thinking do. Spirituality and being spiritual implies internal activity, not stasis or inertia. Given that the terms spirit and spirituality are inextricably linked through etymology, history and culture, spirituality is therefore also about the spirit of a person, which involves but is not limited to the character of a person. Spirits, however, the immaterial kind, such as angels and demons, are entities potentially arising from the polar opposite of the material realms, namely immaterial realms, and having potency, valency, emotional colouring, and intention of their own. They may have ancestral origins, they may have psychic origins, they may have imaginal origins, they may be mythological in nature, they may have messages, they may be helpful and kind, but they may also have an interfering, disturbing or contrary element to them. Spirits, being of immaterial substance, may interact with material realms in the same fashion that immaterial thoughts and imagination can be made material manifest. Spirits of this kind should not be omitted from conversation, since they belong to even our most ancient spiritual divine heritage. Spiritual life may also encompass the practice of specific breathing techniques designed to alter our awareness, wherein we learn from other realms. The term spirit shall also cover the Holy Spirit, which is an active precept, which as an active precept appears consistently throughout human history in one guise or another. That also is food for thought. I hope it's stimulating at some level. And this now technically concludes the presentation I hope you've managed to get or glean some thoughts for yourself about the nature of spirituality and religiosity. There are some differences, of course, between the two terms, but there is much overlap as well. And clearly you can see where I'm headed with my ideas about spirituality. I have a page of bibliography here for you that you can dip into anytime you want. So that's there for you if you really want to take a closer look at it. I'm sorry about the small type there, but you can freeze the page and look more closely at it if you would like to later.